Hey guys, my name is Oleg and welcome to the second part of the devlog for my Unreal Engine 5 game Circulation. This time I will talk about how I implemented the core rotation mechanic and why it took me so long to come up with a design that I was satisfied with. So if you're someone who prefers learning something about game development and a rather technical breakdown of things, then this devlog is for you. Now, this is basically the most important mechanic in the game. Each level has multiple sections or islands that are interconnected with each other. The islands can consist of a central piece and a variety of different rings revolving around it. The rings have gaps in them, which means you cannot just simply cross over to the other side. Instead, you have to rotate the rings into the correct position in order to create a pathway to be able to cross over to the next section. And you as a player can do that by controlling this rotator mechanism. I also call it sender sometimes because it sends the rotation data from this mechanism to the rings revolving around it. And figuring out how this is supposed to work was quite difficult, at least for me, because I couldn't find any examples beyond the usual, pushing a trigger or a button and a door opens and closes. There were two main issues. The first one being how to get this rotation data from this mechanism or the data from the z-axis from the mechanism transferred to the rings. The second problem was the system has to be flexible. That means not all the rings in the scene should be controlled by one single rotator object. Instead, I need to be able to pick out individual rings and assign them to multiple rotator objects that I can place throughout the level. Luckily, I got help from an awesome guy on Twitter. He explained to me the basics on how this should work. Thank you very much. Just a quick side note, don't be ashamed or afraid asking for help. I constantly make this experience where when people see that you're dedicated to your project and you reach out for help, they will help you. And here is how it works. First of all, I set up two different blueprint actors. The first one contains all the platforms or all the rings inside, and the second contains this rotator object that sends the rotation data from the actual rotator to the rings. Now, in the actual rotator or sender object, I'm using the event dispatcher to create an event that contains a float variable. This float variable tracks the old and the new rotation of the rotator object, and with a custom send data event, communicates this information to the rings. Now on the other side, the platform or the ring blueprint constantly listens to the send data, and with another custom event receive data, adds this information to its own world rotation. I also added the possibility to individually adjust the rotation speed of the rings. By dividing the received data with a float called rotation speed, I can adjust the ring rotation to be equal, faster, or slower than the actual rotator object. Now I have to admit, as for someone who is not a programmer like myself, it's still complicated to wrap my head around it, but if it happens that you need help with something like this, let me know in the comments. Now to the second problem, how to assign the individual rings to different rotator objects. Now this wasn't that complicated. In the platform blueprint, I added another variable and made it a reference to the rotator object. And then I exposed the variable. Now I literally can pick the individual rings and assign them to different rotator objects. After the logic was working, I needed something interesting to replace the placeholder mesh. I will talk about design and inspiration in a future video, but simply put, I need something that looks like it belongs there. Because it's a gritty, rusty, metallic environment, the initial design for the rotator object was something like an oil lamp with handles. After creating some very basic sketches, I went to Blender and started working on the mesh. The mesh wasn't that complicated either. It only had to consist of two parts. The upper part, the part that actually rotates, and the lower part, it should look like it mounted to the platform it stands on. So the upper part is basically a cylinder containing a flame surrounded by a cage and handles that the player can push in order to rotate the object. And the foot is a chunky piece of metal surrounded by bolts mounting it to the platform. And because it was fun to experiment, I added physics-based cloth as well. Now the cloth needs to look according to the environment, which means it needs to look old and used. So I created this custom cloth material with holes and tears in it. Now, as soon as the player pushes against the handles, this little flickering flame inside will glow up proportionally to the rotation speed. And when the player stops pushing, the flame will dim down. However, I wasn't quite satisfied, or rather convinced of this design. Although I liked this cozy and warm natural light, I felt like it wasn't quite the right fit for this type of environment, or this type of conveying a certain mechanic. Because it's an object that controls these huge mechanical platforms, I needed another source of energy, something like electricity. So I reworked the oil lamp into a big light bulb. It basically works the same, I just slightly redesigned the form. And instead of this flame particle, the mesh uses a wire glow material and a glass material that can glow as well. And another reason why it took me quite some time to rework or rework those meshes was to find the right dimensions. The proportions of the different parts of the mesh was something I was struggling for some time. The general size of the mesh, the length and height of the handles, and the complexity of the geometry. Now I keep track of the different settings and parts I create in Blender and their measurements to replicate it onto new meshes in order to stay more consistent. So yeah, that's it guys, Circulation Devlog Part 2. I hope it was interesting, I hope you learned something or got inspired. If you saw something that caught your attention and you want to know more about, please leave a comment, and if you like this type of content, please follow the channel if you want videos like that where you can learn something about design and game development. And guys, let's keep working on our games because quality takes time. Thank you for watching, bye.